Well, here we have another great special report from Cannabis Coast to Coast Newsroom, and it's a one-on-one with Paul Armentano, who is the Deputy Director of the NORML, National Organization of Reform of Marijuana Laws, and he comes to us from Maryland, and I so appreciate, Paul, you taking the time out to discuss a little bit about what has been enlighten us a tad about rescheduling, because that is the new buzzword that people in the industry are kind of clinging to. So, Paul, thank you very much for joining us first off.
Absolutely. It's great to be here.
So, rescheduling. The biggest win on this is more a symbolic win that the plant was never supposed to be in a schedule that had no medicinal value because millions of people have used this product for thousands of years medicinally. So taking it off Schedule 1 and moving it to Schedule 3 is a great symbol of at least the government realizes that they didn't classify it properly. Is that a good way to look at this?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. Look, I've said from the beginning of this process that to have the federal government recognize that cannabis possesses therapeutic value, it's a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
You and I have been doing this sort of work a long time, and it wasn't that long ago that not only did the federal government not recognize cannabis's therapeutic value, it actually threatened to prosecute physicians who dared to discuss the fact that cannabis had therapeutic value with their patients. So to have the federal government go from that position that was so hostile to this issue to finally recognizing what the majority of the public and frankly the majority of doctors and scientists have known for quite some time, that cannabis in fact is a legitimate therapeutic agent, I think is a really big deal. And beyond that symbolism, it is possible that recognition could have some tangible benefits potentially to patients. For instance, right now, VA physicians are not permitted to issue medical cannabis recommendations, not because cannabis isn't FDA approved, but because cannabis is Schedule 1. So it's possible that that policy could change with a change in cannabis's scheduling. Right now, there are several states where if someone's injured in the workplace and they use cannabis to help recuperate from that injury, they are not able to be reimbursed for those costs because their workmen's compensation plans won't cover them. When those policies have been challenged and the courts have held that patients can't be reimbursed, the court's logic is because cannabis is Schedule 1. Again, not because it's not FDA approved, but because it's in this specific schedule. Again, we could see those sort of changes in policy happen just by rescheduling. It's not going to address the much broader, larger picture. But I do think that the benefits do go beyond just strictly symbolic.
And that alone is enough. And then if you're in the industry and you're running a company that has minimal margins, which because of all the compliance and the regulations that everybody in this industry that is a plant touching part of the industry has to deal with, at least you could get rid of that vile 280E clause in your taxes and actually write off those basic business expenses that every other business in America has the right to do as a business, but they've withheld it from the cannabis community for a number of reasons. And in other words, that would be a great win for the industry because of how tight everybody is right now.
Yeah, what's interesting about that is we see some political opponents of rescheduling acting as if this would hand some sort of gift to the cannabis industry, when, as you just explained, this isn't a gift at all. Right now, the industry is facing a tax burden that no other industry faces, and that makes it very hard for them to do business. Rescheduling with regard to taxation on the industry simply levels the playing field. It doesn't give them some sort of new advantage, but it does take away an existing disadvantage that the industry has faced.
Absolutely. And one of the questions, as you did your op-ed this week, which I recommend for anybody, just Google Paul's name, Marijuana Moment, put it out there. I subscribe to Tom's newsletter and read it every single day because he really does a great job, I think, of following all the bills and what's going on around the country. But the first thing on here is what is the Controlled Substances Act? And all I can tell you, Paul, is Richard Nixon drove me nuts when I was a 12-year-old because I didn't want to lose my brother to the Vietnam War. Okay. And he's still haunting me to this day because he's the one who got the Controlled Substances Act approved and into law. But shouldn't that be rewritten at this point since we know so much more about all of these drugs that are out there?
So the Controlled Substances Act, there's a lot of, I would dare say, confusion about it. You're correct. This was a law passed by Congress in 1970. So at that time, Congress believed in this idea of setting up five distinct schedules or classifications for controlled substances. Not for all controlled substances, mind you, but for certain controlled substances. And at the time of the passage of the act, some people don't know this, but cannabis was only meant to be in Schedule 1 as sort of a placeholder. This was sort of a temporary categorization because, along with the passage of the CSA by Nixon, language in that same law also established the first and only blue ribbon presidential commission to study cannabis.
Mm.
And that was in shorthand, that's known as the Schaefer Commission, because the chair of that commission was then governor of Pennsylvania, Raymond Schaefer. And in 1972, the Schaefer Commission came out with its findings, its presidential Blue Ribbon Commission findings on cannabis that said this shouldn't even be the possession of cannabis, the gifting of cannabis. These are issues that these are activities that shouldn't even be criminalized. So the idea was in 1970, Congress said fairly accurately, we don't really know enough about cannabis to make an assessment of where it should fit in the scheduling, but we are doing this study on it. So we'll put in Schedule 1 for now, and then when the results of the study come out, we'll revisit the issue. Well, they've never revisited the issue all these years later. As you know, Nixon threw the recommendations of his own commission in the trash and said, I don't want to hear about this ever again. And cannabis has been in Schedule 1 ever since, even though it really wasn't the intent, even at the time, to keep cannabis in Schedule 1, because everyone knew even then it didn't fit the criteria of a Schedule 1 controlled substance.
Right. Absolutely. And it drives me crazy. And we know so much about other drugs right now. I'd really like to see, the amazing thing about this Substances Act is the most dangerous drug that we've seen in the last decade is opioids. And these were prescribed by Western medicine doctors because we know the differences between Western medicine, which really works on symptoms, and Eastern medicine, which goes to causes. And cannabis as a plant medicine has been used in the Eastern side of things for thousands of years. And it's trying to get it to be accepted into this country. I know you know the history, as do I, of the role that race played in the vilification of this plant in the beginning of the 20th century, and then in the Controlled Substances Act, and the words that I know people know this about President Nixon and what he said about those long-haired hippies, and the words that he was using and when he referred to black people. So again, it's to me, it's really time to just blow it all up and redo it and look at the research and studies that have been done on all these other entities. And I'm talking about that codeine, which is on Schedule 3, right? Ketamine is on Schedule 3, if I remember correctly. But you also
Right.
have cocaine, which is on Schedule 2.
Correct.
I mean, this is it's and granted, LSD, heroin doesn't make any sense to me. Although, as you know, what's going on with psilocybin, I find it fascinating that more money and it seems to be more accepted. Psychedelics are becoming more accepted by American capital putting into investments in psilocybin than cannabis. And I've never done a psychedelic, so I'm not afraid to say that. Do you think again? just rejiggering all the schedules would be helpful.
So what's interesting is the law itself was written with the understanding that as time goes on, scientists will learn more
Right.
about all of these substances. So that's why the administrative petition process, which the Biden administration initiated 2.5 years ago, and now the Trump administration has at least said they're looking at reinitiating, that's why that process exists. It exists because Congress understood that they weren't scientists, that they were making determinations on scheduling based on the available information at that time, and that down the road, new information could come to light that would call for revisiting or changing the scheduling of these controlled substances. So that's why there is this petition that says if a third party, or in this case, if the administration believes that there is now science that wasn't considered at the time of the substance's scheduling, but that exists today that warrants a revisiting of that scheduling, then the Department of Health and Human Services should review that science and make a recommendation, which is exactly what happened. As you can imagine, we know exponentially more about cannabis, its therapeutic efficacy, and its safety profile today in 2025 than members of Congress knew about cannabis in 1969, just prior to the passage of the CSA. So, again, the process recognizes that this was an inevitability. The problem is that in practice, this process hasn't worked the way it should because cannabis has been so highly politicized for all of these decades.
That's right. And it's because it's when you look at all the recent polls, you've got, I think it's close to 90% now recognize that it has a medicinal quality to it of all Americans, right? I think it's still more than a majority. I think it was 56% who believe it should be legalized. And I am of the opinion, I share this with everybody. They know this about me, as I talk about normalization and acceptance, not necessarily legalization, but certainly decriminalization, and study it. Will a move to Schedule 3 decriminalize it? It certainly isn't going to legalize it, is it?
No, and it's not going to decriminalize it either. You know, so two things, because you also mentioned research, and I want to talk about that.
Absolutely. Yep.
So the reason the CSA exists is because Congress believed that there should be uniform regulations with regard to certain controlled substances. By uniform, I mean Congress believed that every state should have to follow the same rules with regard to the regulation of these substances. Now, that's different than criminal penalties with respect to the possession of controlled substances. States all have their own criminal statutes with regard to the possession of certain drugs and what the penalties are. And they differ from state to state to state. That's within their jurisdiction. But what a state can't do, for instance, is decide on its own that, you know what, we want to regulate oxycodone differently than the way the CSA says states have to regulate oxycodone. We want to make oxycodone available in grocery stores. That doesn't fly. States don't have the authority to make that decision to divert so significantly from how the CSA says, hey, oxycodone's in this schedule, and therefore Texas, Connecticut, Florida, Alaska, you all have to regulate it the same way. So whether a substance is in Schedule 1, Schedule 2, 3, 4, or 5, as long as it's in that schedule, there is a uniform set of rules with regard to how that substance must be regulated by the states. Right now, the way the majority of states are regulating cannabis, whether it's for medical use or for adult use, does not comport with the way any substance in any one of those 5 schedules are supposed to be regulated. So, if we want to acknowledge that on this particular for this particular substance, states are doing their own thing. They're departing from what the federal government wants. We have this sort of patchwork system where Texas is treating cannabis one way and Connecticut's treating it another way. If we want to acknowledge that sort of patchwork system, and the Trump administration says they do,
Right.
they say, look, this should be a states' rights issue. The Biden administration actually said the same thing. If we're serious about saying, okay, this in fact should be a decision left up to the individual states, and states can treat regulating marijuana however they see fit, then it's got to be off the CSA. It can't be Schedule 1, but it can't be 2, 3, 4, or 5 either, because all of those categories mandate that states treat the drugs that are in those categories in this uniform manner. The reason, for instance, states have such autonomy to set alcohol policies that are divergent from state to state to state is because alcohol is not in the CSA.
Right.
That's why Connecticut can regulate alcohol sales one way, and you can cross the border to New York State and they regulate alcohol sales in a very different manner. It's why certain states can prohibit the use of certain forms of alcohol. It's why for years certain states required watered down beer. States have a whole lot of flexibility with regard to how they regulate the use of alcohol. If we want to acknowledge that states are already doing this with cannabis, and we want to eliminate this state federal conflict that we have now with cannabis being in Schedule 1, then the only solution is to move it out of one and put it take it out of the CSA altogether. Putting it in three sets a whole new set of rules that the states simply won't be following, just like they're not following the rules right now that govern Schedule 1 substances.
But if the symbolic move from 1 to 3 happens, can't Congress take a look at that very well written States Act 2.0 that Dina Titus
Sure.
and Dave Joyce put out there? And because I've read that, and that looks, I kept reading it and reading it. I was getting chills because it was like, this makes sense. This is the first time I've seen something that actually makes sense. This will work, and it should appease both sides of the aisle.
Yeah,
And
again, it acknowledges what's happening right now.
right,
And to me, one of the most frustrating things about cannabis policy right now, when it comes to the federal level, is that it's divorced from what is going on the ground. You have now the majority of states outright flouting federal law. And the federal government just sort of says ho hum and shrugs its shoulders. Now, it's not going after those states. That's a good thing. But it's also not recognizing this is an untenable situation. And that if the majority of states are no longer following the law, then we ought to amend the law to address this conflict. And you're right, that States 2.0 acknowledges that, look, many states have moved in this direction, but not all states. And some states don't necessarily want to move in this direction. And we can set up a system where all of that is allowable. That states that want to create their own legalized regulatory schemes can do so. States that want to keep cannabis criminalized can do so. And the federal government is going to largely get out of the way and let the individual states figure this out for themselves. That's what the federal government did with alcohol almost a century ago. When the federal government repealed alcohol prohibition, it didn't legalize alcohol use and sales nationwide. It didn't even mandate states to go ahead and legalize alcohol. Many states didn't for many years after Prohibition. Again, that's why we have the patchwork system we have now with alcohol, because the federal government didn't set uniform rules for alcohol regulation and mandate those upon the states. Again, we've been down this road before. The answer is really clear and it's right in front of us. It's treating cannabis the same way. And again, the first step to doing that is removing it from the CSA.
right. And I have to talk about the Farm Bill of 2018 because what the government did was define the legal way to use cannabis sativa, the plant, and allow people to derive products from this hemp 0.3% THC. Really and truly, we haven't gotten, it's really more of a cannabinoid issue right now than a plant medicine or a drug issue or whatever. It is because of what the government did. And just hearing Mitch McConnell actually admit that they made a mistake was a great day in my life because they really did legalize this plant. They gave it a federal definition for legalization and then realized, wait, you mean human behavior is going to figure out a way to get high from 0.3%? Oh my God, wait, they're going to be able to put it into drinks? Oh, wait, how come nobody told us this in the beginning? I still maintain that there was somebody, a scientist, had to explain this to somebody in Congress. I mean, tell me, am I wrong? Do you know anybody? I mean, the fact that they didn't understand what they were doing is crazy to me.
It's not crazy when you factor in the reality that when it comes to cannabis and cannabis policy, Congress really never has any understanding what they're doing. And again, it's even clear from going back to when the Biden administration initiated this process. Again, on the day they announced it, you had the administration saying, we want to do this because we think states have the right and we want them to have the ability to set their own cannabis rules and laws. And I'm thinking, but if you want them to do that, then this isn't how you go about doing it. And when, and normal staff had conversations well ahead of that announcement with the administration, laying that out to them, and they never seemed to really get it. And you and I are having this conversation now, and by and large, why I wrote that op-ed, which is also available on NORML's website, is because when I see the conversations that are taking place publicly about this subject, I see a lot of folks passionate on both sides of it, and that's fine as long as we're talking about it from the same facts. And unfortunately, whether it is inadvertent or whether it's on purpose, I see a lot of folks talking about this process and mischaracterizing what it would do. I also think there's quite a bit of mischaracterizations with regard to the potential timeline on this process as well. And I've said that from the very beginning. It was ironic when media and others were asking me, oh, if I thought this would be done before the end of the Biden administration's first term. I just said, are you joking? There's no way. But people seem to think this is something that would be done in a few weeks, when historically, this is the fifth time this process has gone on. Historically, these rescheduling petitions haven't been resolved, or they have been resolved, but it's taken a matter of several years. In fact, NORML filed the first rescheduling petition in 1972. I hate to disappoint your viewers, but that wasn't resolved until 1994. It took 22 years.
God. Ay, 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 ay. Well, that's what I learned about the US government during my 2 days for lobby days. They specialize in delay, delay, and delay, and delay, because I really don't think they know how to pass a bill that is strictly about this plant until they understand how it's been used, how it can be used. And of course, they'd like to get their piece of the pie, just like everybody is looking at this industry still to this day. I have to ask you about what's going on in Texas because, you can't make this stuff up. That's what I keep telling people about what's going on. You've got the Lieutenant Governor, Dan Patrick, basically calling out his governor that, hey, he wants to legalize cannabis and we're going to ban THC in the state. Again, it boggles my mind. There are comments coming out of the Texas Senate, okay, that they believe that hemp isn't a hallucinogenic thing. I'm like, I read that and I was like, are you kidding me? I think I've even heard Patrick say that. I mean, to me, it just shows their ignorance, that they're not doing their due diligence and learning about what this plant is, how it's used, and what impact it has on the human body and the endocannabinoid system. Again, Texas, it boggles my mind. I have friends who live in Texas, and I go, how do you live there? What's going to
Yeah.
happen in Texas, Paul? Any idea?
Oh, I think they're going to outlaw
It is.
hemp-derived intoxicants. I mean, that certainly seems to be the direction they're heading in. What I simply don't understand is why Governor why they're doing it in a special session and why Governor Abbott vetoed a bill in the first place when it seems like he's going to literally sign precisely the same bill. Um,
I
but to your larger point, I've said for the time I've been doing this work that we need to change the conversation surrounding cannabis. We need to change the way we talk about cannabis in order to change the way people think about cannabis. And then we can change public policy. And what is remarkable and what is so often lost in the narrative is how much we know about cannabis, our understanding of cannabis. We know what the active properties in the cannabis plant are. We know the receptors that they interact with in the human body. We know where those receptors are. We know the regulatory process that system interacts with. We know these things. There are plenty of substances and FDA approved medications, I might add, where we don't know the answers to those questions. We don't know why those drugs do the things they do.
right.
But seldom as a society do we even care. When it comes to cannabis, we actually have that understanding, which is why I tend to say we know more about cannabis than many of the medications people use every day. And that's because our understanding is greater. And frankly, it's because cannabis has been subjected to greater scientific scrutiny, which brings me back to this issue you rose earlier about research. No, I'm not of the belief that moving cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3 will stimulate research. And that's because, one, we already have
Right.
volumes of research dedicated to cannabis. Any one of your listeners or your viewers can go on PubMed, type in the term marijuana or type in the term cannabis, and you'll find over 40,000 peer-reviewed papers dedicated to cannabis. About 90% of those have been published in the last 20 or 30 years, right? So we know, as I said, we know exponentially more about cannabis now than we did even a few decades ago. In addition, the biggest hurdles, the sort of impediments that are in place that discourage some scientists from doing research with regard to cannabis, they're not impediments that exist because cannabis is Schedule 1. They're impediments that exist that are statutory, that are specific to cannabis. It's because the way the rules have been written with regard to studying cannabis are different for cannabis than they are for other Schedule 1 substances. For instance, you brought up psychedelics earlier.
Yeah.
If somebody wants to do a clinical trial studying MDMA, it's easier for them to do that trial with MDMA than it is with cannabis. They're both Schedule 1 substances, but there are different rules that apply to cannabis. And unless Congress goes in and changes those rules, the same hurdles that are in place now are in place in the future.
It's crazy. And I knew exactly how many research studies have been done because I follow NORML. Okay. And I read this stuff. I got to go back to 1969 just for a second because I know you're going to know the answer to this next question. Because I'm pretty sure, well, 1969 was an interesting year if anybody knows anything about history. And I always start with sports. That the amazing Mets won the World Series, which was amazing unto itself. But Timothy Leary and the whole story about how Timothy Leary got stopped at the US border carrying cannabis and was arrested and then brought up, I think it was self-incrimination before the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court basically supported the fact that, yes, you incriminated yourself or that's it. And they unanimously basically threw out his case. Isn't that what happened, Timothy Leary?
Yes. So in 1937, Congress passed the first federal prohibition on the possession of cannabis.
Mhm.
But Congress at that time didn't think it had the authority to outright criminalize the possession of cannabis per se. Keep in mind, this is roughly around the same time period where Congress didn't think they had the authority to outlaw people from possessing alcohol without passing a constitutional amendment, right? If Congress thought they could have simply made alcohol illegal, they would have just done it by statute. But they passed a constitutional amendment because they didn't think they had that kind of power. So when it came to cannabis,
Hmm.
they did pass a statutory law, not a constitutional amendment, but that law said explicitly the crime was possessing cannabis without also possessing and having paid for a government issued tax stamp. So that is how the federal prohibition was enforced. You were charged with failure to have the tax stamp, not possessing cannabis. So that is the statute Timothy Leary challenged. You're correct. His case went all the way to the Supreme Court in
Right,
1969, and
right,
the Supreme Court struck down the Tax Act. They said this is unconstitutional. And then months later, you have cannabis placed in Schedule 1. You have Congress passing the CSA that says, well, now we believe Congress has the regulatory authority to prohibit the possession of any substance that we place in Schedule 1.
yeah, and that laid the ground for the CSA and Nixon, and let's not go there.
Yes.
And of course, in '69, there was a little music concert festival going on in upstate New York that was pretty much the celebration of the counterculture at that time. And no, I was not at Woodstock, but I love the music. Okay, it's very simple. I still listen to the music from Woodstock because, after all, I'm 68. Okay, I want to make sure everybody understands this, and I've seen all this happen in my lifetime, and the Waldos get a lot of credit for 420 in 1971. I'm pretty sure is when that all started. Uh, Happened to be the same year that was my first experience with cannabis when I was 14 years old. And I'm not afraid to admit it. I was ADHD. What a shock. I still am. And it helped me hyper focus. That's just a personal note. Paul, I could talk to you for hours because I learn so much from someone who has the encyclopedia in your brain that you do about the history of this plant and the politics of this plant. NORML is very lucky to have somebody like you leading the charge, also having Morgan Fox as your communications director and political director. He does a great job, and I consider Morgan a friend because I've known him really since the beginning of my cannabis journey that started in 2018 as a media guy covering the industry. I want you to have an opportunity to plug the importance of supporting NORML's efforts through a donation, and as small as $4.20. Go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. I just penned a piece for the 50-year anniversary of High Times magazine on this particular subject, and I titled it, Now's the Time to Double Down on Advocacy, because I think there is this false perception among many people that cannabis legalization and further progress on this issue is now just a fait accompli. And it isn't. This isn't something that just organically happens. We only see in this country political and cultural changes take place when advocates agitate for them. And I fear that in recent years, we're not seeing as much agitation as we used to see, that many people have moved on to other topics. When it comes to drug policy reform, psychedelics, for
Right.
instance,
Yep.
because they think, well, there's so much momentum now behind cannabis reform that it will somehow just organically take place. And that's not the way politics works.
No.
Your momentum can swing like a pendulum. And right now, I would dare say we're seeing that pendulum start to move back a
Right.
little bit
Oh,
for a
yeah.
number of reasons. There's been cultural changes and political changes that have taken place in this country in the last 5 to 10 years, and they are impacting. They're making it more difficult, not only for us to pass common sense cannabis laws, but to retain the laws and the changes that we have made in the past. Our political opponents haven't gone away, right? They haven't closed up shop. They've regrouped, they've re-strategized, they've pivoted, and they're now using new methods and strategies to come out against us. And frankly, they're receiving more funding now than they have in the past.
Right.
While conversely, The advocacy movement isn't receiving the same level of funding that we once did.
Hmm.
And for those folks who believe that because there now exists a commercial cannabis industry, that they're going to be the ones to carry the ball forward, that they're going to be the ones to fund advocacy in the future, I've got news for you. In many cases, that industry is struggling. In other cases, when they do give financial support, they give support for efforts that will help their bottom line. They lobby for policies that will help them. I'm not knocking the industry for doing that. It's common sense that they would. But the bottom line is if you favor policies and advocacy that inherently will help cannabis consumers, then you have to fund groups like NORML because that's who we represent and that's who we stand for. And nobody else is going to do it. And these changes just aren't going to happen on their own. They haven't in the past, and they're certainly not going to happen going forward. So again, I definitely encourage our audience to check out NORML's blog, to sign up for our weekly newsletter, and if they're in a position to do so, to help fund our efforts.
Right. And even it's something as little as $4.20 is appreciated by this movement because it seems like the prohibitionists have become emboldened. They're getting more money. They're producing these pack ads and putting them out there on the Fox network. I mean, the fact that the industry can't create public service announcements that are educational, that are pro cannabis, again, is another one of those unfair, unjust things that drives me crazy as an old media guy. So, Paul Armentano, I salute you. I respect you. Keep up the good work. And thank you so much for joining us on this one-on-one special report.